are a special youth envoy to the African Union. So just explain to me, what do you actually do in that position?
Okay, so I sit under the cabinet of the chairperson of the African Union, and this was a decision that came from member states to say that we need to now have more young people within the decision-making processes and executive level of the African Union. So as a result, I was appointed as a youngest diplomat, specifically within the cabinet, but to make sure that I advocate and I also make sure that the voices of young people is truly represented at the decision-making table.
So what are the voices of young people saying?
There's quite a lot that young people are saying. And you know, when I actually got into my role, I decided to go on a listening tour. I embarked on a 60-day listening tour, but because of the demand that's coming from young people and our governments, I've actually now continued with the listening tour every now and again. And the reason for this was because I really wanted to hear from young people themselves through a town hall model where I go to different countries, gather young people through a town hall model, and then I also visit communities through community engagements and end with political and policy advocacy. But one thing that's standing out the most with young people is they still feel that they need to have more representation on the decision-making table. I mean, I'm only one person and I get the privilege and opportunity to sit into the AU Head of States meetings, to attend all these meetings, such as now where I'm under the African Union Chairperson delegation for the UN General Assembly. But when you look now at country level and national level and the political landscape, we do not have a lot of young people in these strategic positions to shape policy, especially young women. And we need to change the narrative. How we need to change the narrative is to start creating spaces for young people. Not only that, to also build their capacities and also share a common view and narrative and create that environment that's conducive for young people to get into political power. When you talk to young people across the continent, majority complain that we're not really happy where we are in terms of socioeconomic development of our continent and some people within their countries. But at the same time, they're also not taking up these spaces. They're not getting into political positions. They're literally, yes, we talk about the challenges of faces, but I think it's another to also be involved in the solutions. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting that the work that you're doing, and it's great that you are listening to these people, but equally, I mean, everyone talks about, oh, Africa is a very young continent, and you know, by so-and-so date, they're going to make up the majority, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, these young people fundamentally want jobs. Before they can even think about representation in government, they need work. And Africa has astonishingly high levels of youth unemployment. So what is the African Union doing to change that?
Okay. I think from the perspective of my role and building my mandate as a political appointee of the African Union, I've been looking at the root cause. What could be the root cause of the high unemployment rate? And one of them is education. Most often actually, we taught, and the tradition is that you go to school and you memorize what you're taught in school, and then there are specific careers that, we grow up, looking towards taking, when we finish and when we graduate. But now you find that when a lot of young people graduate, there are not a lot of opportunities available with the ratio of the people that are graduating from school. That means that we need to go back to the drawing board. How do we actually build young people's capabilities so that they become job creators too? How do we ensure that we create a conducive environment for startups and entrepreneurs? Because if there's a high unemployment rate, then it clearly means that there are not a lot of jobs in the market. And if there are not a lot of jobs in the market, it clearly means that we need to create those jobs. But to create the jobs, it also goes back to our education system. How do we look at young African skills so that they can grow up with the context that they can also become entrepreneurs, they can also build companies that employ other people. Not only that, how do we create the opportunities for young people in a space that is, has a lot of people fighting towards the same resources? We need to protect young people from that exploitation so that they can have access to funding and have access to training, and also look at another angle of tackling this high unemployment rate too.
And do you feel like you've made progress in changing minds within the AU so that they can implement some of these programs?
Okay, so maybe I also speak from the perspective as what we do as African Union Commission, because we execute on behalf of our member states. But what I've tried to do is, with the work that we do, advocate and go down to the country level and get our member states to also look at how they can reshape their policies. For instance, going back to education, just last year, the UN General Assembly, the theme was on, or rather there was a Transforming Education Summit. And as the African Union, we held our own event with the AU head of states to speak about what that means for Africa in transforming education. Specifically within my role, we held consultations, and I worked with a number of young people that are also education advocates to come up with a common view and a common message and a transforming education youth manifesto. So now when we're looking at this youth manifesto, we're bringing together the governments, the multilateral institutions, and the private sector to say, how do we now work towards what has been embedded in this youth manifesto? Again, 2024 is going to be, the African Union theme is going to be transforming education in Africa. But not looking at that alone, specifically if I go back to, some of the recommendations that came from this youth manifesto was that we also need digital innovation and digital transformation, because that's where the world is going. So as an office, we actually launched a digital skills campaign, and within 6 months, we've actually launched the digital skills campaign in 10 countries, where we work with young entrepreneurs, and we also work with the private sector, working in partnership and supported by Google, where we train young people on how they can upskill their startups through leveraging on digital innovation, and how some can actually make a living in the digital economy too.
That's fantastic, and I think awareness of these issues is also one thing, because if people don't know that they exist, then they can't get on board. So that's something that everybody should be trying to tackle. I have to ask you, as a woman in your day-to-day life, I mean, women all over the world, are still trying to fight gender discrimination at work or at home. Specifically, you being in a very male-dominated space in the African Union, how have you found your gender, that gender imbalance? Do you find that people are quite welcoming and appreciative of your ideas, or do you still find a bit of a struggle?
I find that it's something that's common with a lot of young women. First of all, being young, being a woman, and coming from Africa, where we've also had the traditional norms that the male are the ones that go to work and get these, positions. So it's been a challenge. How I've overcome that challenge is having a support system. There are other women within the African Union that are in leadership positions, and through looking at the inspiration of those women and how they've managed to navigate the system, that has also helped me. We also have he for she's. For instance, I was appointed by the chairperson, and again, his priorities are youth and women, and through my role, we also have a special envoy on women, peace and security. That's also changing that narrative, and also making sure that young women, in fact young people and women, are supported in the African Union and by our member states, and leading with that example by having such a cabinet. Again, if we even look at the delegation that came for the United Nations General Assembly, it's a delegation that also is a balanced ratio of women. If we look at our ambassador, our African Union ambassador to the United Nations, who is here as well, she's a woman, and the ambassadors that we have across the African Union. Yeah.
It's great, and it's great to hear about the work you're doing. So my final question to you, in the next 12 months until the next Gabi Summit, what are some concrete things that you would like to see achieved before we all convene again?
I'd like to see more young people on the table. And as much as we have the challenges of high unemployment in Africa, we also have young people doing amazing things. Let them also come to the table, let them share their best practices, and let us see what has worked in Africa. And personally, within the Office of Youth Envoy, we actually started a documentary series that's on the AU Youth Envoy YouTube page. This is to also showcase the wonderful work young people are doing and reshaping this narrative towards young people. Often young people are seen as volunteers in all the work that we do, but young people are professionals, young people bring you to the table, young people are innovative, and young people are also running successful companies in Africa.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much. I look forward to checking out your documentary page.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.